The noon train whistled sharp and clear, cutting through the swirling dust storm that had descended upon Miller's Creek Station. The sound tore across the Wyoming plains like a desperate cry, almost human in its urgency. The wooden platform shuddered as the great iron beast rolled to a stop, steam hissing like an angry serpent, coal smoke hanging thick in the air, despite the wind that sought to scatter it. Abigail Harper stood at the edge of the platform, her fingers white-knuckled around the handle of her worn carpetbag. Her honey-brown hair, once carefully pinned, now escaped in wisps around her face, whipped by the relentless wind. At 32, her features still held beauty, though grief had carved lines around her eyes that no woman her age should bear. She wore her best dress, faded blue cotton, patched at the elbows but clean, a final dignity she'd clung to even as everything else had been stripped away. Around her skirts clustered her children, 4 silent shadows against the gathering storm. Matthew, 12 years old, with his father's determined jawline, stood tallest, one hand clutching the frayed collar of his jacket, the other firmly gripping his brother Nathan's small fingers. The girls, Grace with her serious 8-year-old eyes, and Hannah, barely 6, with 2 missing front teeth, pressed against their mother's sides, their thin shoulders hunched against the biting dust. The station yard buzzed with the usual frontier chaos, cowboys lounging against hitching posts, ranch hands loading supplies, women in town dresses hurrying past with baskets and disapproving glances. No one moved to help the woman with 4 children as she stepped down, gathering Nathan into her arms while keeping watch over the others. "This way," she murmured, voice steady though her heart hammered. "Stay close." They made their way toward the station house, a weathered building that leaned slightly to one side, as though tired of standing against the prairie winds. Abigail scanned the faces in the yard, searching for a man she had never met, but upon whom all her desperate hopes now rested. Warren Mills. The name had become a prayer these past weeks. A widower seeking a wife, he'd answered her carefully worded letter with promises of home and safety. His handwriting had been neat, his words kind. He'd even written that children would be welcome, though she hadn't specified how many in her first letter, fear making her cautious. The station yard grew more crowded as passengers disembarked. 2 men staggered from the saloon across the street, their argument carrying above the wind. They shoved against each other, faces flushed with whiskey and anger boots scuffing dust. Their brawl spread outward like ripples in a pond, forcing people to step back or be caught in the fray. "Mama," Grace whispered, tugging at Abigail's skirt. "Is that him, the man we're meeting?" "Not yet, sweetheart. He'll be here soon." Abigail forced confidence into her voice. Warren had promised to meet the noon train. Perhaps he was simply delayed. The fighting men lurched closer. One, bearded with a scar across his cheek, stumbled backward, his shoulder colliding hard with Abigail. The impact knocked her sideways. Nathan slipped from her grasp, falling toward the hard-packed earth with a silent gasp that tore at Abigail's heart more than any scream could have. Before she could reach for him, Matthew lunged forward, trying to catch his little brother. The bearded man swung around, fist raised in blind, drunken fury, and struck Matthew across the face. The boy crumpled, blood streaming from his nose. "Watch where you're standing, woman," the man snarled, swaying on his feet. His bloodshot eyes narrowed as he took in Abigail and her children. "Well, now, what's this, a widow with her brats?" His companion laughed, a harsh sound like grinding metal. "Mail-order bride, looks like. Bringing a whole litter with her." Abigail knelt beside Matthew, helping him sit up, while reaching for Nathan, who lay unnaturally still and quiet on the ground. The little boy's eyes were wide open, staring at the sky, but he made no sound, showed no reaction to his fall. He hadn't spoken or cried since the day his father died, as though all his words had been buried alongside Joseph in that collapsed mine shaft. "Leave us be," Abigail said, her voice low but firm. She'd faced worse than drunken cowboys in Pennsylvania. The mine owner's threats, her brother-in-law's cruel proposals, these had taught her that showing fear only invited more cruelty. The scarred man leaned closer, his breath sour with whiskey. "4 brats and no man. What fool would take on such a burden?" His hand shot out, grabbing Matthew by the collar and hauling him up. "This one's big enough for the mines. Pay good money for boys with strong backs." Matthew struggled his feet, barely touching the ground, blood still streaming from his nose. His eyes found his mother's not with fear, but with the same stubborn pride his father had shown until his last breath. "Let him go!" Abigail demanded, rising to her feet, with Nathan clutched against her chest. The girls pressed behind her, Hannah whimpering softly. The man's grip tightened. "Or what, widow, you got no one here. No one who'd stand for the likes of, let the boy go." The voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried a weight that silenced the yard. It belonged to a man who stood a few paces away, his stance relaxed but purposeful. He wasn't tall, perhaps 5'10", but something in the way he held himself made him seem larger. His clothes were plain faded work shirt, dust-covered trousers, well-worn boots. A weathered Stetson, shaded eyes the color of a winter sky. The drunk squinted at the newcomer. "Mind your business, Hayes. I'm making it my business." The man Hayes stepped forward. In one fluid motion, he gripped the drunk's wrist and applied pressure to a specific point that made the fingers spasm open, releasing Matthew. "Go sleep it off, Jenkins. You're making a fool of yourself." Jenkins cursed, but stepped back, rubbing his wrist. His companion tugged at his arm, suddenly wary. "Come on, not worth it." His eyes darted to Hayes's right hip, where the worn handle of a revolver was visible beneath his open coat. As the men retreated toward the saloon, Hayes turned to Matthew, who stood rigid, wiping blood from his face with his sleeve. "You all right, son?" Matthew nodded once, pride keeping his chin up, despite the trembling in his shoulders. Hayes's attention shifted to Abigail, his gaze assessing, but not unkind. "Ma'am." He tipped his hat slightly. "Samuel Hayes. You seem to be waiting for someone." Abigail straightened, gathering her dignity around her like armor. Nathan remained unnaturally still in her arms, his small face expressionless despite the commotion. "Warren Mills," she said. "He was to meet us on the noon train." Something flickered across Samuel's face, recognition followed by what might have been regret. He glanced away briefly, then met her eyes again. "I know Mills," he said finally. "But he's not coming." The words struck Abigail like physical blows. She swayed slightly but remained standing. Grace pressed closer to her side, small fingers digging into her skirt. "Not coming," she repeated, her voice hollow. Samuel Hayes shifted his weight, uncomfortable but direct. "Warren Mills married Loretta Jenkins 3 months ago. Judge Harker's daughter from over in Fort Collins." The last of Abigail's hopes crumbled. She'd spent every penny on the train tickets, sold her wedding ring, Joseph's pocket watch. Everything of value. There was nothing left to take them back east, and nothing to go back to except her brother-in-law's threats to take the children to pay Joseph's mining debts. Matthew stepped closer to his mother, shoulders squared despite his bloodied nose. "We'll be fine, Mama," he said quietly, though the slight crack in his voice betrayed his fear. Samuel Hayes watched them, his expression unreadable. His eyes lingered on Nathan, taking in the boy's vacant stare, the way he clutched a small, worn drawing pad even as he remained limp in his mother's arms. "What happened to your boy?" he asked, nodding toward Nathan. Abigail hesitated, but something in Hayes's manner, direct yet without pity, prompted honesty. "He hasn't spoken since his father died," she said. 18 months now. He was there when the mine collapsed. Heard the timbers break." She swallowed hard. "He draws those tunnels over and over. And fire. Always fire." Samuel's face remained composed, but something shifted in his eyes. A recognition, perhaps, or a memory. He looked away, scanning the horizon where the dust storm was gathering strength, then back to the family standing before him adrift in a hostile land. "I have a place," he said finally. "A ranch about 2 hours' ride from here. It's not much, but there's shelter." Murmurs rippled through the onlookers who had gathered to watch the scene unfold. A woman in a calico dress shook her head. "Hayes taking in strays now," she whispered to her companion. "The quiet ones are always trouble." "That's the one who fought at Antietam," an old man muttered. "Never been right since." Samuel seemed not to hear them, his attention fixed on Abigail. She clutched Nathan tighter, weighing impossibilities against desperation. "Why would you help us?" she asked, caution, born of hard experience, making her wary. Samuel didn't smile, but something in his face softened slightly. "Winter's coming. No place for children to be without shelter." He nodded toward Nathan. "And that boy needs quiet. Won't find it here." Abigail looked at her children, Matthew trying so hard to be brave, the girls wide-eyed with exhaustion and fear, Nathan still and silent in her arms. What choice did she have? What option but to trust this stranger with their lives? "I have 4 children," she said finally, her voice catching, "and nothing to offer in return. You still want to help us." Samuel Hayes looked at each child in turn, his gaze lingering longest on Nathan. Something passed behind his eyes. A shadow, a memory before he answered. "You're going with me," he said simply. He bent to pick up her carpet bag, then gestured toward a wagon hitched at the edge of the yard. "We should leave now. Storm's coming in fast." As they walked toward the wagon, Abigail felt the stares of the townspeople, some curious, some disapproving, some openly hostile. The old man who had mentioned Antietam spat into the dust. "Hayes is a strange one," he called after them. "Keeps to himself. Too quiet by half." Samuel helped the children into the wagon bed, lifting them one by one with careful hands. When he reached for Nathan, Abigail hesitated, then allowed him to take the boy. Nathan remained limp, his eyes fixed on the gathering clouds, but he didn't resist when Samuel settled him beside his sisters and tucked a rough blanket around them all. Matthew climbed up last, positioning himself protectively near the younger children. His eyes followed Samuel's every move, wary as a young wolf. "You fought in the war?" he asked abruptly, as Samuel helped Abigail onto the wagon seat. Samuel paused, one foot on the wheel, spoke. "Yes, my pa fought too, before I was born." Samuel nodded once, acknowledging this confidence, then climbed up beside Abigail. He took up the reins, his hands sure and steady. "It'll be rough going with the storm," he said, glancing at the darkening sky. "But we'll make it before nightfall." As the wagon pulled away from Miller's Creek, Abigail allowed herself one backward glance at the station, at the life she'd imagined meeting her there, at the last of her hopes left behind in the dust. Then she faced forward, back straight, despite the weariness that settled in her bones. Beside her, Samuel Hayes drove in silence, his profile etched against the gathering storm like something carved from weathered stone. The journey to Samuel Hayes's ranch passed in a blur of dust and wind. The storm grew steadily worse, forcing them to move at a crawl through swirling clouds, that reduced visibility to mere yards. Samuel handled the team with quiet confidence, speaking occasionally to the horses in a low, steady voice that seemed to calm them despite the howling wind. Abigail held her shawl over her face, turning periodically to check on the children huddled in the wagon bed. Matthew had positioned himself as a windbreak for the younger ones, his thin shoulders hunched against the stinging dust. Grace and Hannah pressed together beneath the blanket, their eyes squeezed shut. Nathan lay curled against his older brother, his small face expressionless even as the wind tore at his hair. "How much farther?" Abigail asked, when the wagon rounded a bend in the crude trail offering momentary shelter from the worst of the gale. "Not far now," Samuel replied, his voice barely audible above the wind. "See that rise ahead? Ranch is just beyond." Abigail squinted through the dust. Ahead, a low ridge broke the monotony of the prairie, a few twisted cottonwoods clinging to its crest. As they drew closer, she made out the dark shapes of buildings nestled against its base. A small cabin, a barn, what appeared to be a corral. The wagon crested a gentle slope, and Samuel's ranch came into full view. It was modest but well-kept, a cabin, built of hewn logs with a stone chimney, a sturdy barn corrals for livestock, and what looked like a small kitchen garden protected by a rough fence. Beyond stretched a pasture where a few cattle grazed, and further still a field of wheat rippling in the wind. Samuel guided the wagon into the yard and drew the team to a halt before the cabin. He set the brake and wrapped the reins around it before turning to Abigail. "Wait here while I check inside," he said, then jumped down from the seat. He approached the cabin cautiously, one hand resting near his hip where the revolver hung. He circled the building once, checking windows and the back door before returning to the front porch. Only then did he gesture for them to join him. "Habit," he explained briefly when he caught Abigail's questioning look. "Always check." Matthew helped his sisters down from the wagon while Abigail carried Nathan. The little boy remained limp in her arms, his eyes now closed as though the journey had exhausted him beyond endurance. His small drawing pad was clutched against his chest pencil, still tied to it with a piece of string. The cabin's interior was simple but clean. One large room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace along one wall. A rough-hewn table stood in the center with 4 chairs. Shelves lined another wall holding books, jars, and implements. A curtain partially concealed a sleeping area in the corner with a narrow bed. 2 smaller pallets were visible beyond it. "It's not much," Samuel said, watching their reactions. "But it's dry and warm once the fire's going." Grace and Hannah stood close together, taking in their surroundings with wide eyes. Matthew remained by the door, shoulders tense, ready to defend or flee. Abigail felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, all their lives, now dependent on this stranger's goodwill. "Thank you," she said simply. The words seemed inadequate, but she had nothing else to offer. Samuel nodded once, then moved to the fireplace. "Storm's getting worse. I'll get a fire started, then see to the horses." He glanced at Nathan in her arms. "There's a bed through there. Boy looks done in." Abigail carried Nathan to the curtained alcove and laid him gently on the narrow bed. He didn't stir, his breathing even and deep. She brushed the hair from his forehead, noting the smudges of dust on his pale skin, the shadows beneath his eyes. 4 years old and carrying a weight no child should bear. When she returned to the main room, Samuel had a fire crackling in the hearth. He straightened, dusting his hands on his trousers. "I'll sleep out here," he said, nodding toward the fire. "You and the children take the beds. There's food in the pantry, not much, but enough for tonight. Tomorrow, we'll sort things proper." Before Abigail could respond, he'd taken his coat and hat and slipped out the door into the howling storm. Through the window she watched his figure move toward the barn, head bent against the wind. "Mama," Grace whispered, tugging at her skirt. "Is this our home now?" Abigail knelt, gathering her daughters close. "For now, sweetheart, Mr. Hayes is being very kind to let us stay." "I don't trust him," Matthew said from his position by the door. His face was still smeared with dried blood from his earlier encounter with the drunk. "Why would he just take in strangers? Nobody does that." Abigail sighed, too tired to argue, but understanding her son's suspicion. Joseph's death had taught them all that the world could be cruel and unpredictable. "We don't have many choices right now, Matthew," she said quietly. "But we'll be careful, and we'll help earn our keep." While the girls explored the cabin under Matthew's watchful eye, Abigail found the pantry a small alcove with shelves of preserved foods, flour, coffee, and other staples. It was modestly stocked, but organized with care. She set about preparing a simple meal, finding comfort in the familiar routine of cooking after the chaos of their journey. By the time Samuel returned from the barn, stamping dust from his boots on the porch, she had soup warming on the stove and cornbread in the oven built into the side of the fireplace. He paused in the doorway, surprise flickering across his features at the domestic scene before him. The cabin had transformed in his absence, the table set with the few mismatched dishes he owned, the girls seated on a bench with combed hair and washed faces, Matthew awkwardly carrying a bucket of water from the indoor pump to the wash basin. "Didn't expect this," he said, removing his hat. "It's the least we can do," Abigail replied, "though I hope you don't mind me using your supplies." Samuel shook his head. "They're there to be used." He hung his hat on a peg by the door and moved to the wash basin, rolling up his sleeves to reveal forearms corded with lean muscle and marked with several old scars. He washed quickly, efficiently, then dried his hands on a towel Grace shyly offered him. Dinner was a quiet affair. Samuel ate methodically, his attention seemingly focused on his plate, though Abigail noticed how his eyes regularly scanned the windows and door, a habit she guessed born of wartime vigilance. Matthew watched him with equal intensity, protective instincts on high alert. The girls ate hungrily, exhaustion making them quieter than usual. When the meal was finished, Samuel stood. "I'll check the property once more before full dark," he said. "Storm's easing some." "You expect trouble?" Matthew asked bluntly. Samuel considered the boy for a moment before answering. "No, but expecting is different from being ready." He retrieved his rifle from beside the door, an Army Spencer Abigail noted well-maintained despite its age. "Lock the door behind me. I won't be long." After he'd gone, Abigail helped the girls prepare for bed. The smaller pallet easily fit both of them, and they curled together like kittens asleep almost immediately. Matthew insisted on making a bed near the fire, refusing the comfort of the main bed even when Abigail offered to share it with Nathan. "I want to be by the door," he said stubbornly. "In case." Abigail didn't argue. Her son had appointed himself protector after Joseph's death, and denying him this role would only add to his anxiety. Instead, she kissed his forehead and smoothed his hair, noticing with a pang how much he resembled his father, the same determined set to his jaw, the same direct gaze. "You're a good boy, Matthew," she whispered. "Your father would be proud." She checked on Nathan, who hadn't stirred since being laid on the bed. His small body curled around his drawing pad pencil still clutched in his fingers. Gently, she worked both from his grasp and set them on a small table beside the bed. As she did, the pad fell open, revealing his latest drawing, a tangle of black lines representing the mine tunnels, but something new. A small figure standing at the entrance, arms outstretched as though holding back the darkness. The sound of the door opening made her turn. Samuel stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of dust and night air. He secured the door with a heavy wooden bar, then propped his rifle carefully against the wall within easy reach. "All quiet," he reported. "Storm's mostly past." He moved to the fire, adding another log from the stack beside the hearth. The flames leapt higher, casting his profile in sharp relief. The straight nose, the firm mouth, the slight furrow between his brows that seemed permanent rather than temporary. Abigail noticed for the first time a thin scar that ran from his right temple to his jaw, barely visible in the firelight. "Your boy," he said suddenly, his voice low so as not to wake the children. "The one who doesn't speak. Has he seen doctors?" Abigail joined him by the fire, drawn by the genuine concern in his question. "2 in Pennsylvania. They called it shock of the mind, said he might speak again in time, or he might not." She swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "We couldn't afford more doctors after that." Samuel nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I've seen it. In the war. Men who stopped speaking after what they witnessed." He hesitated, then added, "Some found their voices again." "Did you—" The question slipped out before Abigail could stop it. Something in his manner, in the careful way he moved through the world, suggested personal knowledge of such silence. Samuel's eyes met hers, surprise evident in their pale depth. For a moment, she thought he might not answer. 2 years, he said finally. After Antietam. Couldn't form words. His gaze returned to the fire. Found them again eventually. The admission hung between them unexpectedly intimate. Abigail felt a shift in her understanding of this quiet man who had taken them in not simple charity then, but recognition. Empathy born of shared experience. "I should let you rest," Samuel said, breaking the moment. He gestured toward a chest in the corner. "There are extra blankets if you need them. I'll sleep here by the fire." "You've given up your bed for us," Abigail protested. "At least take one of the pallets." He shook his head. "I don't sleep much anyway. Old habits." And he settled himself on a bench near the hearth, his back against the wall, legs stretched toward the fire. It looked uncomfortable, but his expression suggested the position was familiar. Abigail hesitated, then returned to the bed where Nathan lay. She stretched out beside her son, careful not to disturb his sleep. Through the partial opening in the curtain, she could see Samuel still seated by the fire, his profile illuminated by the dancing flames. His eyes were open, watchful, one hand resting near the rifle propped against the wall. A guardian, she thought drowsily, as exhaustion finally claimed her, or a man haunted by ghosts of his own. The first light of dawn filtered through the cabin's small windows, painting stripes of gold across the rough-hewn floor. Abigail woke with a moment of disorientation, the unfamiliar ceiling above her bringing a surge of panic before memory returned. Nathan lay curled against her side, his breathing deep and even, one small hand clutching her sleeve, as though afraid she might disappear. Through the partially open curtain she could see the main room. Samuel was already up, moving quietly about the cabin. He added wood to the banked coals in the fireplace, pumped water into a kettle and set it to heat. His movements were economical, practiced a man accustomed to solitude and self-sufficiency. Matthew's pallet by the door was empty, the blankets neatly folded. A quick scan of the room didn't reveal him, and a flutter of concern rose in Abigail's chest. She eased herself away from Nathan and slipped from the bed, smoothing her rumpled dress as best she could. Samuel looked up as she emerged from the sleeping area. "Morning," he said with a nod. "Coffee's brewing." "Thank you." Abigail glanced around the cabin again. "Have you seen Matthew?" "Out helping with the horses," Samuel replied. Boy was up at first light, wanting to make himself useful. A hint of approval colored his tone. Got a good head on his shoulders. Relief washed through her. Of course, Matthew would be trying to prove his worth, to establish himself as valuable necessary. After Joseph's death, he'd tried to take on his father's responsibilities, far too much for a child his age to bear. He feels he needs to take care of us all, she said, moving to check on the girls, who still slept soundly on their pallet. Samuel poured coffee into 2 tin cups, offering one to Abigail. Nothing wrong with wanting to protect family. He hesitated, then added, but he's still a boy. Needs to know that's allowed. The insight surprised her. This quiet rancher saw more than he let on. The door opened and Matthew entered, his face flushed with cold and exertion. He carried an armful of firewood, which he carefully stacked beside the hearth. Mr. Hayes showed me how to brush down the horses. He reported, a note of pride in his voice. Said I did it right the first time. That's wonderful, Matthew. Abigail smiled, grateful for Samuel's kindness to her son. Did you thank Mr. Hayes for teaching you? Matthew nodded, darting a glance at Samuel that held less suspicion than the night before. Yes, ma'am. He says he'll show me how to mend the chicken coop later if it's all right with you. That would be fine, Abigail said, meeting Samuel's eyes over her coffee cup. Thank you, she added softly. Samuel acknowledged her gratitude with a slight nod, then turned to pour a cup of coffee for Matthew. Half milk, he told the boy. If you're going to work like a man, you might as well drink like one. The simple gesture, treating Matthew with respect rather than condescension, earned Samuel another fragment of Abigail's trust. Her son took the cup, solemnly holding it as though it contained something precious. The day unfolded with the steady rhythm of ranch life. After breakfast, hearty porridge sweetened with the last of Samuel's molasses chores were divided among them all. Samuel took Matthew to repair the chicken coop, then to check on the small herd of cattle grazing in the pasture. Grace helped Abigail clean the cabin and prepare vegetables from the garden for dinner. Hannah, not to be outdone, insisted on collecting eggs from the handful of chickens that scratched in the yard. Nathan remained silent but watchful, following Samuel with his eyes whenever the man was in sight. When Samuel and Matthew left for the pasture, the little boy stood at the window, drawing pad clutched to his chest, watching until they disappeared over the rise. He likes Mr. Hayes, Grace observed, pausing in her sweeping to join her brother at the window. Maybe because Mr. Hayes doesn't try to make him talk. Abigail considered this insight, impressed, as always, by her daughter's perceptiveness. Grace had always been sensitive to the feelings of others, noticing small details that many adults missed. Mr. Hayes understands, she said carefully. He told me he couldn't speak for a while after the war. Grace's eyes widened. Really? But he got better. Yes, he did. Abigail smoothed her daughter's hair. And Nathan will too, in his own time. As the afternoon waned, Abigail found herself in the small kitchen garden behind the cabin, harvesting the last of the season's tomatoes. The garden showed the same careful attention as the rest of the ranch: neat rows, sturdy supports for climbing plants. A simple irrigation system that brought water from the nearby stream. Not the work of a careless man or one without patience. The sound of a wagon approaching drew her attention. She straightened, shading her eyes against the lowering sun. A vehicle was indeed coming up the trail to the ranch, a light buggy drawn by a single horse. As it drew closer, she made out the figure of a well-dressed man, perhaps in his 50s, with a neat beard and an expensive-looking hat. Matthew and Samuel had returned from the pasture and now stood in the yard watching the approaching visitor. Samuel's posture had changed, no longer relaxed, but alert, one hand resting near his hip, where his revolver would be if he were wearing it. The buggy pulled into the yard and stopped. Its occupant regarded the scene before him with obvious surprise, Samuel standing with Matthew at his side. Abigail emerging from the garden, the girls peering from the cabin doorway. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Quite the domestic scene, Hayes. I hardly recognize the place." Samuel's expression remained neutral. "Blackwood," he acknowledged with a nod. "Didn't expect to see you before the first of the month." The man Blackwood stepped down from his buggy, adjusting his coat with fastidious care. "Bank business waits for no man, I'm afraid." His gaze swept over Abigail, assessing in a way that made her straighten her spine. "And who might this be?" "Mrs. Harper and her children," Samuel replied, his tone giving nothing away. "Staying here for a time." Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "Indeed. How charitable of you, Hayes." He approached Abigail, removing his hat with a flourish. "Victor Blackwood, ma'am. I own the bank in Miller's Creek and a few other establishments." He smiled, revealing teeth too perfect to be natural. "Samuel here is one of my clients." The way he emphasized the word suggested a relationship more complicated than simple banking. Abigail inclined her head politely, but didn't offer her hand. Something about Blackwood's manner, the practice to charm the calculating eyes, reminded her of the mine owners back east, men who viewed people as resources to be used. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Blackwood," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "You'll excuse me if I don't invite you in for tea. We're still settling in." Of course, of course." Blackwood replaced his hat, his smile never reaching his eyes. "I merely came to discuss some business with Hayes. Perhaps we could step inside your cabin, Samuel, more private." Samuel glanced at Abigail, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, understanding his reluctance to leave her and the children alone with this man, but also recognizing the need for privacy. "Matthew, help your mother finish in the garden," Samuel instructed. "I won't be long." As Samuel and Blackwood disappeared into the cabin, Matthew moved to Abigail's side. "I don't like him," he whispered, eyes fixed on the closed door. "He looks at things like he's counting what they're worth." "Some men do that," Abigail agreed, returning to her harvesting but positioning herself where she could see the cabin door. "It doesn't make them right." They worked in silence for several minutes before Matthew spoke again. "Mama, do you think we can stay here with Mr. Hayes?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't know, Matthew. Mr. Hayes has been very kind, but this is temporary. We can't impose on him forever." Matthew's face fell, and Abigail realized with a pang that her son had already begun to form an attachment to Samuel, or perhaps more accurately to the idea of having a man to learn from, again a father figure, in a world that had taken his own too soon. "We'll find our own place eventually," she added gently. "But for now, we're fortunate Mr. Hayes has taken us in." Before Matthew could respond, the cabin door opened. Blackwood emerged first, his expression tight with barely concealed anger. Samuel followed, his face impassive, but his eyes hard as flint. "Think about what I said, Hayes," Blackwood called over his shoulder as he strode to his buggy. "Time's running short." His gaze swept over Abigail once more, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "Perhaps we'll meet again, Mrs. Harper, under more settled circumstances." As the buggy pulled away, Samuel remained on the porch watching until it disappeared down the trail. Only then did his shoulders relax slightly. He turned to find Abigail and Matthew watching him. "Everything all right?" Abigail asked, noting the tension that still radiated from him. "Fine," Samuel replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just business." He glanced at the basket of tomatoes they'd gathered. "Good harvest. Last of the season, I expect." The abrupt change of subject told Abigail more than words could have. Whatever had transpired between Samuel and Blackwood was not something he wished to discuss, at least not in front of the children. She respected his privacy, just as he had respected hers. "Matthew was a great help," she said, following his lead. "He has a good eye for which ones are ripe." Matthew straightened at the praise, a smile breaking through his usual serious expression. Samuel nodded, the hard look in his eyes softening as he regarded the boy. "Good man to have around," he agreed. "Now, how about we see about dinner getting late? And I promised Hannah I'd show her how to make Johnny cakes." As they headed toward the cabin, Nathan appeared in the doorway, his small figure silhouetted against the warm light within. He held his drawing pad open, a new picture visible on its page. When Samuel approached, the boy held it up silently. Samuel crouched to examine the drawing. Abigail, watching from a few steps away, saw surprise flicker across his features. Nathan had drawn the cabin with stick figures standing before it. 5 figures, one taller than the rest. A family. "That's good work," Samuel said quietly, meeting Nathan's solemn gaze. "You've got a steady hand." He pointed to the tallest figure. "That, me." Nathan nodded once, the first direct response he'd given anyone since the mine collapse. Samuel didn't make a fuss over this small victory, didn't push for more. He simply nodded in return, a silent understanding passing between man and child. "Come on, then," he said, rising to his feet. "Time to eat." As they entered the cabin, Abigail lingered a moment on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The vast Wyoming sky blazed with color gold and crimson and deepest purple. So different from the close hills of Pennsylvania, the constant shadow of the mine that had dominated their lives. Perhaps here in this open country, her children could find room to heal. Perhaps she could too. Inside, lamps were being lit against the gathering darkness. Grace and Hannah set the table, while Matthew pumped water into the wash basin. Samuel stood at the stove with Nathan at his side, the little boy watching intently as cornmeal was mixed with water and formed into small cakes. A temporary shelter, Abigail reminded herself. A brief respite on their journey. But as she closed the door against the coming night, she couldn't help but wonder if they had stumbled upon something more enduring than they'd dared to hope. The evening settled around the cabin like a comfortable blanket, bringing with it a sense of peace Abigail hadn't expected to find in this strange place. After dinner, a hearty stew with the last of the garden vegetables, Samuel surprised them all by retrieving a battered checkerboard from a shelf. "Used to play with my brother when we were boys," he explained, setting it up on the table. "Any takers?" Matthew volunteered first, eager to prove himself. He and Samuel hunched over the board. The boy's face screwed up in concentration, while Samuel played with casual skill, occasionally suggesting a better move when Matthew was about to make a mistake. Grace and Hannah sat on a braided rug near the fire, combing each other's hair and whispering together as sisters do. Nathan had retreated to a corner with his drawing pad, but Abigail noticed he positioned himself where he could watch the checkers, game his eyes, following each move. The domesticity of the scene made Abigail's throat tighten unexpectedly. How long had it been since they'd enjoyed such a simple, peaceful evening? Since Joseph's death, their lives had been consumed by mere survival. Finding enough food, avoiding her brother-in-law's increasingly aggressive demands, planning their escape. She busied herself with mending by the light of an oil lamp, repairing a tear in Hannah's dress. The rhythmic motion of the needle was soothing, giving her hands purpose, while her mind processed the tumultuous events of the day. Warren Mill's failure to appear, Samuel's unexpected offer of shelter, Blackwood's visit, and the undercurrent of tension it had created. What had the banker meant by "time's running short"? And why had he looked at her with such calculating interest? A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, drawing her from her thoughts. Outside, the weather was turning again, the clear evening giving way to storm clouds that blocked the stars. A rumble of thunder rolled across the prairie, distant but approaching. Hannah looked up from her place by the fire, her young face anxious. "I don't like storms," she whispered. "It's just the sky talking," Grace told her sister with the confidence of her 8 years. "Papa used to say that, remember." Hannah nodded, but her lower lip trembled. "I remember, but it's scary anyway." Samuel glanced up from the checkerboard. "Thunder's nothing to fear," he said matter-of-factly. "Just the sound of air moving faster than it wants to. Like when you clap your hands real loud." He demonstrated with a sharp clap that made Hannah jump, then giggle. "Does the sky have hands?" she asked, momentarily distracted from her fear. "No, but it has clouds that bump together," Samuel explained. "Makes the same kind of noise, just bigger." Matthew captured one of Samuel's checkers, grinning triumphantly. "Got you!" Samuel feigned dismay, drawing another giggle from Hannah. "So you did. Better watch myself, or you'll have my whole army." Another rumble of thunder sounded closer now. Hannah's smile faded, and she pressed against Grace's side. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin briefly through the small windows. Abigail set aside her mending and moved to sit with her daughters. "Come here, sweethearts," she said, opening her arms. Both girls scrambled into her lap, though Grace tried to maintain a brave face. "Would a song help?" Abigail asked, smoothing Hannah's hair. "Like we used to do during the storms back home." Hannah nodded eagerly, and even Grace looked relieved at the suggestion. Matthew pretended indifference, focusing on the checkerboard, but Abigail could tell he was listening. She began to sing softly a lullaby her own mother had sung during prairie storms when Abigail was a child. Her voice was clear and true, though she hadn't sung much since Joseph's death, another joy that grief had stolen. "Lay down your head, and I'll sing you a lullaby, back to the years of Luli-Lile. And I'll sing you to sleep, and I'll sing you tomorrow, bless you with love for the road that you go." The simple melody filled the cabin, rising above the growing storm outside. Hannah's eyes grew heavy, her small body relaxing against Abigail's chest. Grace hummed along, remembering the tune from years past. When Abigail glanced up, she found Samuel watching her, the checkerboard momentarily forgotten. His expression was impossible to read, but something in his eyes, a softness, a memory perhaps, caught her by surprise. He looked away quickly when their gazes met, returning his attention to the game. But a moment later, as Abigail continued to the second verse, she noticed a subtle change. Samuel's right hand had moved to his shirt pocket, pressing against something hidden there, a gesture that seemed unconscious, intimate. His eyes were focused on the checkerboard, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. The storm grew fiercer, rain lashing against the windows, wind howling around the cabin's corners. Lightning flashed more frequently, followed by crashes of thunder that made the girls flinch, despite Abigail's continued singing. Even Matthew abandoned the pretense of the game, moving his chair closer to the table's edge, nearer to his family. Only Nathan seemed unaffected, still drawing in his corner, occasionally glancing up at the windows when lightning illuminated the room. A particularly violent thunderclap shook the cabin, and Hannah buried her face against Abigail's neck with a whimper. In the momentary silence that followed, Abigail became aware of movement from the corner. Nathan had risen from his spot and was crossing the room with deliberate steps. He paused beside Samuel's chair, his small face solemn in the lamplight. Everyone watched, breath held, as Nathan slowly extended his drawing pad toward the man who had taken them in. Samuel accepted it carefully, as though handling something precious. The page showed a new drawing, the cabin again, but this time with rain falling around it, lightning forking across the sky. Yet inside the cabin's walls, the stick figures were safe, gathered together. "That's right," Samuel said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion Abigail couldn't name. "We're safe in here." He met Nathan's gaze directly. "Storm can't get us." Nathan nodded once, then, to everyone's astonishment, climbed onto Samuel's lap. He didn't speak, didn't smile, but he settled there as though it were the most natural thing in the world, his back against Samuel's chest, his head tucked beneath the man's chin. For a moment, Samuel seemed frozen, his hands hovering uncertainly. Then, with infinite gentleness, he allowed one arm to curl around the boy, providing security without restraint. His eyes met Abigail's over Nathan's head, a question in their pale depths. She nodded, giving permission, understanding, blooming in her heart. Nathan, who had withdrawn from the world after witnessing horror, had recognized something in Samuel. A kindred spirit, someone who had walked through darkness and found his way back. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the cabin something had shifted. A fragile bridge had been built, a first step toward healing taken. As Abigail resumed her song, her voice stronger now, she watched Samuel's tension gradually ease his hand, coming to rest lightly on Nathan's shoulder. The boy's eyes drifted closed, his small body relaxing in sleep for the first time since they'd arrived. Samuel remained perfectly still, as though afraid any movement might break this unexpected trust. In the flickering lamplight, with rain drumming on the roof, and her children finding moments of peace, Abigail allowed herself to hope cautiously, fearfully, that perhaps they had found not just shelter from the storm, but a place to begin again. Days at the Hayes Ranch settled into a rhythm that brought unexpected comfort to Abigail and her children. Each morning began before dawn with Samuel already up and tending to essential chores when the rest of the household stirred. Matthew was always quick to join him, eager to learn the skills of ranch life, feeding livestock, mending fences, checking the small herd of cattle that grazed in the nearby pasture. The girls found their own places in this new life. Grace, thoughtful and observant, helped Abigail with household tasks and took charge of the chickens, displaying a natural way with the temperamental birds. Hannah, bright and curious, followed Samuel around whenever Matthew wasn't monopolizing his attention, peppering him with endless questions that he answered with surprising patience. And Nathan, silent, watchful. Nathan began to emerge slowly from his shell. He still didn't speak, but he shadowed Samuel like a small ghost, watching his every move with solemn attention. Each evening, he would present a new drawing, his world expanding beyond the dark mine tunnels that had haunted his art for so long. Now there were horses, chickens, the cabin under open skies, small glimpses into a mind beginning to heal. A week after their arrival, Abigail stood at the kitchen window, kneading bread dough while watching Samuel and Nathan in the yard. The man was repairing a broken wheel from the wagon, his strong hands working methodically with tools. Nathan sat cross-legged nearby, drawing pad on his knees, occasionally looking up to study Samuel's movements before returning to his sketch. "He's good with them," came a voice from behind her. Abigail turned to find Grace watching the same scene, her young face, thoughtful beyond her years. "Mr. Hayes," Grace clarified. "He doesn't talk much, but he listens. Not like the adults back home who just pretended to listen." Abigail smiled at her daughter's perceptiveness. "Yes, he does seem to understand what people need, even when they don't say it." Grace moved closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I think he's lonely. There are 4 plates in the cupboard, but they don't match. Like he collected them one by one, not as a set for a family." The observation struck Abigail with unexpected force. She hadn't considered the evidence of Samuel's solitude that surrounded them, the mismatched dishes, the single chair that was more worn than the others, the sparse personal belongings. A man accustomed to being alone who had nevertheless opened his home to 5 strangers. "We should be grateful for his kindness," Abigail said, resuming her kneading. "But remember, Grace, this is temporary. We can't impose on Mr. Hayes forever." Grace nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Where will we go?" It was the question Abigail had been asking herself each night, as she lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie, the distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of wind through prairie grass, the occasional restless movement of Samuel, making his rounds of the property. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted, "but I'll figure it out. I always do." Grace smiled, trusting her mother's determination, as she always had. "I know you will, but I like it here." Before Abigail could respond, a sharp cry from outside caught their attention. Both rushed to the window to see Hannah sprawled in the dirt near the chicken coop, clutching her knee. Matthew was already running toward her from the barn, while Samuel set aside his tools and strode quickly to the fallen child. Abigail hurried outside, wiping her flour-covered hands on her apron. By the time she reached Hannah, Samuel had already knelt beside the girl, examining her injury with careful hands. "Just a scrape," he pronounced, his tone calm and reassuring. "Looks worse than it is?" Hannah's lower lip trembled as she regarded her bloodied knee. "It hurts," she whispered. "Course it does," Samuel agreed matter-of-factly. "Knees have lots of feeling in them, but you know what else they have?" He waited until Hannah looked up at him. "Lots of toughness. Knees are built to take a beating and keep on going." Hannah considered this, her tears slowing. "Like leather." A ghost of a smile touched Samuel's lips. "Just like that. Tougher than they look." He glanced up at Abigail, who had reached them slightly breathless. "Nothing serious, but it could use cleaning." "I'll take care of it," Abigail said, reaching for her daughter. "I can help," Samuel offered, surprising her. "Got some salve that works well on scrapes. Medical supplies in the barn." He lifted Hannah with ease, cradling her as though she weighed nothing. The little girl wrapped her arms around his neck, her momentary pain forgotten in the novelty of being carried by this tall, quiet man who rarely initiated physical contact. Matthew hovered nearby, concern for his sister warring with curiosity. "What kind of salve?" "Made it myself," Samuel replied, leading the way toward the barn. "Learned from an old army doctor. Works on horses and people both." Inside the barn, a small room had been partitioned off, at one end part workshop, part storage area. Samuel set Hannah gently on a wooden bench and opened a cabinet mounted on the wall. Inside were neatly arranged bottles, jars, bandages, and instruments that looked decidedly medical in nature. "You have quite a collection," Abigail observed, helping Hannah roll up her torn pant leg. Samuel selected a brown glass jar and some clean cloths. "Force of habit," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Out here, doctor might be days away when you need one." He knelt before Hannah and dampened a cloth from a canteen hanging nearby. With gentle efficiency, he cleaned the scrape, his touch sure but careful. Hannah watched him with wide eyes, momentarily forgetting her pain. "You do this like a real doctor," she said. Samuel's hands paused briefly before continuing their work. "Had practice," he replied. Then, perhaps sensing the inadequacy of the response, he added, "Was a medic in the war. Field hospital at Antietam, then Gettysburg." The admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Abigail found herself studying Samuel's profile more intently, the lines around his eyes that spoke of having seen too much, the careful precision of his movements as he tended to Hannah's minor injury with the same seriousness he might give a life-threatening wound. Did you fix lots of people? Hannah asked with a child's directness. A shadow crossed Samuel's face. Some, he said quietly. Not all. He opened the jar of salve, a greenish mixture with a sharp medicinal smell, and applied a thin layer to Hannah's knee before covering it with a small bandage. There, he said, his voice lightening with deliberate effort. Good as new in no time. Hannah beamed at him. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Then, with the resilience of childhood, she hopped down from the bench and skipped toward the barn door, already forgetting her injury. Can I go feed the chickens now? Careful around that loose board by the coop, Samuel called after her. That's what tripped you up in the first place. As Hannah disappeared into the sunlight, Abigail found herself alone with Samuel in the dim barn, Matthew having followed his sister to ensure she didn't immediately injure herself again. An awkward silence fell between them. Thank you, Abigail said finally. You're good with them. The children, I mean. Samuel busied himself returning the medical supplies to the cabinet. They're good kids, he replied. Making themselves useful. Don't need to thank me for that. Abigail stepped closer, her curiosity overcoming her usual caution. Were you really a medic? Samuel's shoulders tensed slightly, but he nodded. 2 years. Saw more than I care to remember. Is that why? Abigail hesitated, unsure if she was overstepping. Why, you understand, Nathan, because of what you saw in the war. Samuel turned to face her, his expression guarded yet not hostile. For a long moment, he seemed to weigh his response, as though deciding how much to reveal. After Antietam, he said finally, his voice low. I couldn't speak for almost 2 years. Saw too many men die under my hands. Young men. Boys, some of them. He glanced toward the barn door where sunlight streamed in. Your boy saw something no child should see. Mind protects itself, however it can. The admission created a bridge between them, fragile, unexpected. Abigail felt a shift in her understanding of this quiet man who had taken them in. Not simple charity then, but recognition. Empathy born of shared pain. Will he speak again? She asked the question that had haunted her for 18 months. Samuel's eyes met hers direct and honest. Can't promise that. But he's drawing things besides those tunnels now. That's a start. Before Abigail could respond, a sound from outside caught their attention, hoofbeats approaching the ranch at speed. Samuel's demeanor changed instantly, tension replacing the momentary openness. Stay here, he instructed, moving swiftly to a shelf where a revolver lay partially concealed beneath a cloth. He checked it with practiced efficiency, then strode toward the barn door. Abigail followed, despite his directive maternal instinct driving her to locate her children. From the barn doorway, she saw Matthew and the girls already running toward the cabin, responding to the sudden tension in the air with the wariness of children who had learned that strangers often meant trouble. A horse and rider appeared over the rise, moving fast. Even at a distance, Abigail recognized the expensive suit and hat. Victor Blackwood. The banker was alone this time. His horse lathered with sweat, as though he'd pushed the animal hard to reach the ranch. Samuel positioned himself in the yard, revolver now holstered at his hip, but clearly visible. His stance was relaxed, but alert, ready for whatever might come. Blackwood reined his horse to a stop, dust billowing around the animal's hooves. Hayes, he called, not bothering to dismount. We need to talk. Now. Nothing's changed since your last visit, Samuel replied, his voice even. Blackwood's face flushed with anger. Everything's changed. You have 2 weeks, not a month. The railroad's moving faster than expected. I need your decision. 2 weeks is still 2 weeks, Samuel said. I'll give you my answer when I'm ready, not before. Blackwood's gaze shifted to Abigail, standing in the barn doorway. A calculating smile replaced his scowl. Mrs. Harper, isn't it, I trust you're finding Hayes's hospitality adequate? The implication in his tone made Abigail straighten her spine. Mr. Hayes has been most generous, she replied coolly. Has he told you about his predicament? Blackwood asked, feigning surprise. No, how ungentlemanly. He turned back to Samuel Malice, glinting in his eyes. Tell her, Hayes. Tell her how you're about to lose this ranch, how you can't possibly offer her and those children any kind of future here. Samuel's expression remained impassive, but Abigail saw his hand tighten at his side. That's enough, Blackwood. The railroad's coming through, Mrs. Harper, Blackwood continued, ignoring Samuel. Right across this land. Hayes here owes the bank more than he can pay, and time's run out. He smiled, showing two perfect teeth. Of course, there are other arrangements that could be made. For a woman in your position, I could be very accommodating. The implication was clear, and revulsion rose in Abigail's throat. Men like Blackwood had approached her after Joseph's death, offering protection in exchange for subservience, presenting the illusion of choice when there was none. Samuel moved suddenly, placing himself between Abigail and Blackwood's leering gaze. I said that's enough. He repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. You've delivered your message. Now leave. Blackwood's smile faded. 2 weeks, Hayes. Then this land is mine, one way or another. He jerked the reins, turning his horse. Think about what I said, Mrs. Harper. A smart woman knows when to choose the winning side. With that parting shot, he rode away, pushing his horse to a gallop that seemed unnecessarily harsh. Samuel watched until he disappeared over the rise, then turned to find Abigail regarding him with a mixture of concern and questions. Is it true? She asked quietly. About the ranch. Samuel sighed, removing his hat to run a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of discomfort. Partly, he admitted. Took a loan after a bad winter 2 years ago, lost half my cattle to the cold. Been paying it back, but Blackwood's changed the terms since the railroad survey came through. He wants your land for the railroad. Samuel nodded. Land values have tripled wherever the line's going. Blackwood's buying up everything he can, then selling to the railroad company at a profit. His jaw tightened. My grandfather built this place. My father expanded it. Not about to let it go to a man like Blackwood. Abigail absorbed this information, understanding now the tension that had radiated from Samuel during Blackwood's previous visit. What will you do? Fight it, Samuel said simply, as though no other option existed. Got some savings hidden away. Might be enough to cover what's owed if I sell a few head of cattle. He paused, then added with clear reluctance, but you should know, in case you and the children need to make other arrangements. The unspoken message was clear: Samuel might not be able to provide shelter much longer. The precarious sanctuary they had found could vanish in 2 weeks' time. I understand, Abigail said, though her heart sank at the prospect of uprooting her children again, of facing the unknown with even fewer resources than before. Thank you for being honest. Samuel replaced his hat, his expression returning to its usual reserve. Better check on the children, he said. Make sure they're all right. As he strode toward the cabin, Abigail remained in the barn doorway, watching his retreating figure. Another complication in a life that seemed determined to deny her any foothold of stability. Yet even as worry gnawed at her, she found herself thinking not just of her own family's fate, but of Samuel's, as well, of the quiet determination with which he faced the possible loss of his heritage, his home. The rest of the day passed in strained normalcy, with Samuel returning to his chores and the children resuming their activities, though Matthew watched the adults with suspicious eyes, aware that something had shifted. That evening, after the younger children were asleep, Abigail found Samuel on the porch, cleaning his rifle by the light of a lantern. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast Wyoming sky like diamond dust. "May I join you?" she asked, pulling her shawl tighter against the autumn chill. Samuel nodded, moving slightly to make room on the bench. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, the only sounds the rhythmic movement of the cleaning rod through the rifle barrel and the distant call of night birds. "I've been thinking," Abigail said finally, "about what Mr. Blackwood said today." Samuel's hands paused momentarily before resuming their work. "Man talks too much," he commented, though without real heat. "Perhaps," Abigail agreed, "but it made me realize we haven't discussed arrangements for our stay here." She took a deep breath, forcing herself to continue despite her discomfort. "We can't keep imposing on your hospitality without contributing something in return." Samuel set the rifle aside, turning to face her more directly. The lantern light carved deep shadows beneath his cheekbones, making his expression difficult to read. "You and the children are pulling your weight," he said. "More than." "That's kind of you to say, but we both know 5 extra mouths to feed is a significant burden, especially now." Abigail clasped her hands in her lap to stop them from fidgeting. "I have skills beyond housekeeping. I worked as a seamstress before I married Joseph, and I learned basic medical care helping him treat injured miners. I could seek employment in town." Samuel's brow furrowed. "Miller's Creek's not a place for a woman alone." "I've managed in worse places," Abigail countered, though the prospect of returning to the town where Jenkins and his ilk lurked was admittedly daunting. Samuel was silent for a long moment, seemingly weighing his words. "There's another option," he said finally, "if you're willing to hear it." Abigail nodded, curiosity piqued by his careful tone. "Stay," he said simply. "Help run the ranch. It's too much for one person anyway, and Matthew's got a knack for the cattle. Could use a woman's touch around the place." He hesitated, then added, "If I manage to keep it, that is." The offer surprised her. It wasn't charity exactly, but a proposition of mutual benefit, his need for help balanced against her family's need for shelter. "And if you can't keep it?" she asked softly. Samuel's eyes met hers, steady in the lamplight. "Then we both find a new path. But no sense worrying about that bridge till we reach it." The practicality of his approach was reassuring. No false promises, no pressure, just an honest assessment of their situation and a reasonable proposal. After Joseph's death, Abigail had grown wary of men offering solutions that always seemed to come with hidden costs. Samuel's straightforward manner was refreshingly different. "I'll consider it," she said, not wanting to rush such an important decision. "Thank you for the offer." Samuel nodded, returning to his rifle cleaning. But as Abigail rose to go back inside, he spoke again, his voice softer than before. "Found something today, in the storage chest." He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small object that glinted in the lantern light. "Thought the girls might like to have it." He held out his palm, revealing a small silver brooch shaped like a flower, simple but beautiful, with a pearl at its center. "It was my mother's," he explained. "Don't have much use for ladies' trinkets myself." The gesture touched Abigail deeply, not just the offering of the brooch itself, but the thought behind it. Samuel had noticed how Grace and Hannah had taken to playing dress-up with their meager belongings, pretending to be fine ladies at a ball, despite their worn dresses and scuffed shoes. "They would treasure it," she said carefully, taking the brooch. "But Are you certain it must hold memories for you? Something flickered across Samuel's face, a shadow of old grief quickly controlled. Better to see it worn than sitting in a box, he said. Then, with a slight shift in tone, your girls remind me of my sisters sometimes. Same spirit. It was the first mention he had made of a sister, another small piece of the puzzle that was Samuel Hayes. Abigail wondered what had happened to his family, why he lived alone on this ranch with so few personal mementos visible. But she didn't ask, respecting his privacy, as he had respected hers. "Thank you," she said simply, closing her fingers around the brooch. "Good night, Samuel." It was the first time she had used his given name, the formality of Mr. Hayes seeming suddenly inappropriate after the personal nature of his gift. He nodded a barely perceptible acknowledgement of the subtle shift in their relationship. "Good night, Abigail." She returned to the cabin, closing the door softly behind her. The children slept peacefully. Grace and Hannah curled together on their pallet, Matthew on his bedroll near the fire, Nathan in the bed they now shared. In the dim light of the banked fire, Abigail studied the silver brooch, running her thumb over its delicate surface. A family heirloom freely given. A glimpse of the man beneath the quiet exterior. She placed the brooch carefully in her small wooden box of treasures, the few keepsakes she had managed to bring from their old life, including Joseph's wedding ring and a lock of each child's baby hair. As she prepared for bed, Abigail's mind turned over Samuel's offer. Stay and help run the ranch. Build something here in this wild, beautiful place, where her children were already beginning to put down tentative roots. It was tempting, more tempting than she cared to admit. But Blackwood's threat loomed like a storm on the horizon. 2 weeks until Samuel might lose everything. 2 weeks until they might all be adrift again. Abigail slipped into bed beside Nathan, gathering his small, warm body close. He stirred slightly, murmuring in his sleep, not words but sounds, more vocalization than he had shown in months. Another small victory, another step toward healing. Whatever came, she decided drowsily, they would face it together. For now, that would have to be enough. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with a hint of frost glittering on the grass. October was giving way to November, and the first real cold of winter wouldn't be far behind. Abigail rose early, finding Samuel already at the stove, coffee brewing and bacon sizzling in a cast-iron pan. "Morning," he greeted her, his voice rough with sleep, or perhaps lack of it. Dark circles beneath his eyes suggested another night of restless vigilance. "Thought you might appreciate a hot breakfast. Day's going to be busy." "Oh." Abigail moved to help slicing bread from the loaf she'd baked the previous day. "What's happening?" "Need to ride into town for supplies," Samuel explained, turning the bacon with practiced efficiency. "Flour's running low and we'll need more preserves to get through winter." He hesitated, then added, "Thought you might want to come along. You and the children haven't left the ranch since you arrived." The invitation surprised her. A trip to town meant being seen together, inviting speculation about their arrangement. But it also meant an opportunity to establish herself as more than just a charity case, to be introduced to the community as someone with a place and purpose at the Hayes Ranch. "I'd like that," she decided. "The children could use a change of scenery, and I should see what Miller's Creek has to offer if we're to stay in the area." Samuel nodded, seemingly pleased by her acceptance. "We'll take the wagon. Leave after breakfast." The children received the news with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Matthew was eager to see more of the territory, while Grace and Hannah were thrilled at the prospect of visiting a proper store. Only Nathan showed reluctance, clinging to Abigail's skirts with unusual insistence. "It's all right, sweetheart," she soothed, kneeling to his level. "We'll all be together, and we'll come back to the ranch before dark." Nathan's solemn eyes studied her face, searching for reassurance. After a moment, he nodded slightly and released her skirt, though he remained closer than usual as they prepared for the journey. The ride to Miller's Creek took just over an hour, the wagon creaking along the rutted trail that connected the ranch to town. Samuel handled the team with easy confidence, while Matthew sat beside him on the bench, absorbing every detail of how the horses were managed. Abigail and the younger children rode in the wagon bed cushioned by straw and blankets against the jolting journey. As they approached the outskirts of town, Abigail felt Nathan tense beside her. The little boy pressed against her side, his eyes wide, as he took in the unfamiliar buildings and the increased activity. She wrapped an arm around him, providing silent support. Miller's Creek was larger than it had appeared during their brief stop at the train station. A proper main street boasted a general store, a small hotel, a bank, 2 saloons, a livery stable, and various other establishments. People moved about their business, ranchers in for supplies, women shopping or visiting cowboys, lounging near the saloons. The railroad had not yet reached this far, but anticipation of its arrival was evident in the new construction visible at the edge of town. Samuel guided the wagon to a hitching post in front of the general store, setting the brake and wrapping the reins securely. "Best if we stick together," he advised, as he helped Abigail and the children down. "Town's growing fast, lots of strangers passing through." His protective manner drew curious glances from passers-by. A woman sweeping the boardwalk outside the millinery paused to stare openly, while 2 men loading supplies into a freight wagon exchanged knowing looks. Inside the general store, the atmosphere was one of organized chaos. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, packed with everything from tools to textiles. Barrels of flour, sugar, and coffee beans stood in neat rows, while glass jars of candy and tobacco occupied a counter near the proprietor's desk. The rich mingling of smells, leather, coffee, spices, fabric, brought a rush of nostalgia to Abigail. It reminded her of similar stores back east, where she had shopped with Joseph in happier times. The storekeeper, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers, looked up from his ledger as they entered. His eyebrows rose at the sight of Samuel, accompanied by a woman and 4 children. "Hayes," he greeted, surprise evident in his tone. "Didn't expect to see you before the first snow." His curious gaze shifted to Abigail and the children. "And with company, no less." Samuel nodded tersely. "Tillman, need supplies." He handed over a list written in his neat, precise handwriting. "And whatever the lady and children require." Tillman's eyebrows climbed higher. "Indeed. Well, well." He turned to Abigail with undisguised curiosity. "Ma'am, welcome to Miller's Creek. Don't believe I've had the pleasure." "Abigail Harper." She introduced herself, offering a polite smile that revealed nothing of her discomfort at being the center of attention. "And my children, Matthew, Grace, Hannah, and Nathan." "Harper, is it?" Tillman repeated, glancing between her and Samuel. "And you're staying out at Hayes's place." Before Abigail could respond, Samuel intervened. "Mrs. Harper is helping run the ranch," he said, his tone discouraging further questions. "We'll need enough supplies for 6 through winter." Tillman seemed about to press for more information, but something in Samuel's expression made him think better of it. Of course. Let me fill this order for you. Feel free to look around while you wait." He bustled off to gather the requested items, though not without a backward glance of lingering curiosity. Samuel turned to Abigail. "Get whatever you and the children need," he said quietly. "Don't worry about the cost." Abigail was about to protest pride, making her reluctant to accept more charity, when she caught sight of Nathan staring fixedly at a display near the counter. Following his gaze, she saw what had captured his attention, a set of colored pencils and a proper sketch pad displayed alongside other writing implements. The longing in her son's eyes was unmistakable. His current drawing pad was nearly full, and the stub of pencil he used was worn to a nub. These art supplies were clearly of much higher quality than anything he had used before. Before she could consider the expense, Samuel had already moved to the display. He examined the pencils and pad, then called to Tillman. "Add these to our order," he instructed, picking up the items. Nathan's eyes widened as Samuel knelt before him, holding out the treasures. "For proper drawings," Samuel said, his voice gentler than Abigail had ever heard it. "Your hands know what to do with these better than mine would." For a breathless moment, Abigail thought Nathan might speak. His lips parted, a small sound escaping. But instead, he reached for the gifts, with trembling fingers clutching them to his chest once they were securely in his possession. His eyes, meeting Samuel's, conveyed what words could not: gratitude, connection, trust. Samuel nodded, as though a full conversation had passed between them, then straightened. "Girls," he called to Grace and Hannah, who were admiring a display of ribbons. "Pick one each. And Matthew, Mr. Hayes." The call came from the store entrance, where a young man had appeared, breathless and agitated. "Come quick. There's trouble at the bank." Samuel tensed, immediately alert. "What kind of trouble, Billy?" "It's Jenkins and his boys," the young man explained. "They're causing a ruckus, saying something about Hayes' land and the railroad. Mr. Blackwood called for the sheriff, but he's out of town till tomorrow." A muscle worked in Samuel's jaw. "Abigail," he said, turning to her, "stay here with the children. I'll handle this." "Be careful," she urged, concern rising at the mention of Jenkins, the same drunk who had threatened Matthew at the train station. Samuel checked his revolver, then strode toward the door. "Lock it behind me, Tillman," he instructed the storekeeper. "Don't open it unless it's me or the sheriff's deputy." As the door closed behind him, an uneasy silence fell over the store. Tillman hurried to secure the lock, then returned to his counter, fidgeting nervously with his ledger. "Don't you worry, Mrs. Harper," he said, attempting reassurance. "Hayes can handle himself. Man fought at Antietam, you know, and Gettysburg." "So I've heard," Abigail replied, gathering her children closer. Nathan pressed against her skirts, his new treasures clutched tightly, as though he feared they might be taken away. Through the store window they could see a crowd gathering further down the street near the bank, a solid brick building that stood out among the wooden structures surrounding it. Men moved toward the commotion, some with the purposeful stride of those anticipating trouble, others with the reluctant shuffle of those hoping merely to witness it. "Mama," Matthew said quietly, his young face serious. "I should go help Mr. Hayes." "Absolutely not," Abigail replied firmly. "You'll stay right here, where it's safe." "But he's outnumbered," Matthew protested. "Jenkins has at least 3 men with him. I heard Billy say so." Abigail placed her hands on her son's shoulders, meeting his eyes directly. "Matthew, listen to me. You're 12 years old. You're brave and strong for your age, but this is not your fight. Mr. Hayes wouldn't want you to put yourself in danger. The best way you can help him is by staying here and helping me protect your brother and sisters." The appeal to his protective instincts worked. Matthew's shoulders straightened and he nodded reluctantly. "Yes, ma'am." A distant shout drew their attention back to the window. The crowd had grown, obscuring their view of whatever was happening near the bank. Occasional raised voices carried to them, though the words were indistinct. "What do they want with Mr. Hayes's land?" Grace asked, her small face pinched with worry. Tillman, unable to resist the opportunity to share information, leaned across his counter. "It's the railroad, miss," he explained, "coming through from Cheyenne. Wherever it goes, land values soar. Blackwood's been buying up properties along the surveyed route, then selling to the railroad company at a profit. He lowered his voice conspiratorially. Hayes's ranch sits right where they want to put a water stop and maybe a small station. Prime location. But it's Mr. Hayes's land, Hannah protested with a child's sense of justice. They can't just take it. Well now, Tillman hedged. There's the matter of the loan. Hayes borrowed against the property after that terrible winter 2 years back. Lost half his herd to the cold and disease. Blackwood holds the note, and word is he's calling it due. Abigail frowned at the storekeeper's casual revelation of Samuel's private business, but before she could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. The crowd was parting, and through the gap strode Samuel, his expression grim but composed. Behind him, Jenkins and another man were being led away by a deputy, both sporting bloody noses and sullen expressions. Relief flooded through Abigail as Samuel approached the store. Tillman hurried to unlock the door, stepping back as Samuel entered. The rancher's knuckles were scraped and a bruise was forming along his jawline, but otherwise he appeared unharmed. "Everything all right?" Tillman asked, eyes wide with barely suppressed excitement. "Fine," Samuel replied curtly. He turned to Abigail and the children, his expression softening slightly. "Sorry about that. Jenkins had too much whiskey and too many ideas about my property." "Are you hurt?" Grace asked, her voice small with concern. Samuel shook his head. "Just a scuffle. Nothing serious." He looked to Abigail. "We should finish our business and head back to the ranch. Don't want to be on the road after dark." They completed their purchases quickly, Samuel paying from a leather pouch he kept in his inner coat pocket. The supplies were loaded into the wagon under the curious stares of townspeople who had gathered to watch news of the altercation having spread rapidly through Miller's Creek. As Samuel helped Abigail onto the wagon seat, positioning her beside him, rather than in the back with the children, a woman called from the boardwalk. "Mrs. Harper, a moment if you please." Abigail turned to see a well-dressed woman of about 50 hurrying toward them, a basket over one arm. Her gray-streaked hair was neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, and her expression was kind, if somewhat harried. "I'm Margaret Thompson," she introduced herself, slightly breathless from her rush. "I run the boarding house just down the street." She gestured vaguely behind her. "I heard you were in town and wanted to introduce myself before you left." Abigail smiled, touched by the friendly overture. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Thompson." "Margaret, please," the woman insisted. "We don't stand on ceremony much out here." She glanced at Samuel, who was securing the last of their purchases in the wagon. "Mr. Hayes doesn't come to town often, so when Billy Tillman told me he'd arrived with a family in tow, I had to see for myself." There was no malice in her curiosity, only genuine interest, and perhaps a touch of concern. Margaret lowered her voice slightly. "I wanted to make sure you and the children are comfortable out there. The Hayes Ranch is rather isolated, and Samuel has always been, well, a solitary sort." The implication was clear. Margaret was offering assistance if Abigail found herself in an uncomfortable situation with the taciturn rancher. The concern was touching, if unnecessary. "Mr. Hayes has been nothing but kind and respectful," Abigail assured her. "We are very grateful for his hospitality." Margaret studied her face, apparently satisfied with what she saw there. "Well, that's good to hear. Should you ever need female company or advice, my door is always open." She handed Abigail a small jar from her basket. "Wild raspberry preserves, my specialty. The children might enjoy them." "Thank you," Abigail said, genuinely moved by the gesture. "That's very kind." Samuel approached, nodding politely to Margaret. "Mrs. Thompson." "Samuel," she returned with a warm smile. "Good to see you in town, though I hear you've been making quite an impression at the bank." A ghost of a smile touched Samuel's lips. Jenkins needed cooling down. Deputy Waters handled the rest. Margaret chuckled. So I heard. Well, don't be strangers, either of you. Church social next Sunday. Might do you and the children good to meet some of the townsfolk, Mrs. Harper. With that, she bustled away, leaving Abigail with the distinct impression that news of their arrival in Miller's Creek would be the primary topic of conversation at the boarding house dinner table that evening. Samuel helped her up to the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. The children were already settled in the back, among the supplies. Nathan carefully cradling his new art materials. The girls admiring their chosen ribbons, and Matthew keeping watch over it all with the seriousness of a young guardian. As they pulled away from the general store, Abigail noticed the stares that followed them, some curious, some speculative, a few openly hostile. Samuel seemed oblivious or perhaps simply accustomed to being the subject of town gossip. You have a friend in Margaret Thompson, he commented as they left the main street behind. Good woman, fair-minded. She seems kind, Abigail agreed. She invited us to the church social on Sunday. Samuel was silent for a moment, his eyes on the road ahead. Would you like to go? He asked finally. You and the children. The question held more weight than its simple words suggested. Appearing together at a social function would cement certain assumptions in the minds of the townspeople, assumptions about their relationship, their future. I think it might be good for the children, Abigail said carefully, to meet others their age, but only if you're comfortable with it. Samuel nodded, apparently satisfied with her answer. Sunday, then. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the wagon creaking along the rutted trail, the children's occasional comments and questions drifting forward from the back. The confrontation in town seemed to have shifted something between them, a shared challenge faced together, another small step toward trust. As the ranch came into view on the horizon, Samuel cleared his throat slightly. About what happened in town, he began, his voice lower than usual. Jenkins and his kind, they're just Blackwood's muscle. The real fight is with Blackwood himself. Why does he want your land so badly? Abigail asked. Surely there are other properties along the railroad route. Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. It's not just about the railroad. It's personal. He paused, as though weighing how much to reveal. Blackwood wanted this land even before the railroad survey. Made offers for years ever since my father died. Always refused him. But why your land specifically? Samuel was silent for so long that Abigail thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had roughened with some emotion she couldn't quite identify. There's a reason I took that loan from him after the bad winter, he said. No other bank would lend to me. Blackwood made sure of that. His jaw tightened. He's been waiting for me to fail to default. The railroad just gave him a better excuse to force the issue. The pieces began to fall into place for Abigail, the personal nature of the conflict, the satisfaction in Blackwood's manner when he'd spoken of Samuel losing the ranch. This was more than a business transaction. It was a vendetta. What happened between you? She asked softly. Samuel's profile was etched against the afternoon sky, strong and unyielding, yet somehow vulnerable in that moment of decision to trust or not to trust. Blackwood had a son, he said, finally, the words coming with obvious difficulty. Miles, same age as me. We fought together at Antietam. His knuckles whitened on the reins. I was a field medic. Miles took a Confederate bullet in the chest. Died under my hands. The simple statement contained volumes of unspoken pain. Abigail's heart contracted with sympathy. And Blackwood blames you, she surmised quietly. Samuel nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head. Told me I should have saved him, that I chose to let him die. His voice had flattened emotion pressed down beneath the weight of long practice. Doesn't matter that we lost 30 men that day, that I worked for 20 hours straight, hands so covered in blood I couldn't tell one man's from another's. The rawness of the memory was evident in every line of his body, in the careful control he maintained over his voice. Abigail resisted the urge to reach for his hand, sensing that such a gesture might break the fragile moment of disclosure. "That's why you came here," she said instead, "to get away from the memories." "This was my father's ranch," Samuel corrected gently. "I came home because there was nowhere else to go after the war. After—" He trailed off, leaving whatever had followed Antietam unspoken. They crested the final rise before the ranch, the cabin and outbuildings visible in the golden afternoon light. Home, or something close to it for him, and increasingly for her children. For her. "Thank you," Abigail said simply, "for telling me." Samuel glanced at her, surprise evident in his pale eyes. "Thought you should know what you're getting into. Staying here means facing Blackwood's anger, his influence." The warning was fair, the concern genuine. Abigail considered her response carefully, aware that much depended on her next words. "My husband died because the mine owner refused to replace rotting support timbers," she said, her voice steady, despite the old pain the memory evoked. "Joseph knew the danger, reported it many times. The collapse killed him and 6 others, but the owner called it an unfortunate accident and offered the widows a pittance in compensation." She met Samuel's gaze directly. "I'm not afraid of men like Blackwood. I've faced them before." Something shifted in Samuel's expression, respect perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. He nodded once, acknowledging her strength and her choice. As the wagon rolled into the ranch yard, the children's excited voices filling the air as they recounted their adventures to each other, Abigail felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This place, these people, they had become more than a temporary shelter. They had become, against all odds, and her own cautious nature, something like home. The future remained uncertain, with Blackwood's threat looming just 2 weeks away. But for the first time since Joseph's death, Abigail felt the stirring of something long dormant within her chest. Hope fragile, but persistent, like the first green shoot after a harsh winter. The Sunday of the church social dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the grass silver and the breath of cattle rising in steamy plumes against the blue Wyoming sky. Abigail woke early, a flutter of nervous anticipation in her stomach. Today, they would appear in town as a unit, not as desperate strangers who had stumbled off a train, but as a household with purpose and place. She had spent the previous day preparing washing and pressing the children's best clothes, mending tears, and polishing scuffed boots. For herself, she had only the blue dress she'd worn on their arrival, now carefully cleaned and altered to fit her slimmer frame. The months of hardship had taken their toll on her figure, leaving her more angular than she had been in Pennsylvania. In the main room, Samuel was already up, stoking the fire to drive away the morning chill. He nodded at her emergence, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. "Morning," he greeted. "Sleep well." "Well enough," Abigail replied, moving to help with breakfast preparations. "The children are excited about today." Samuel made a non-committal sound, though Abigail suspected his reticence stemmed more from the prospect of social interaction than any real objection to the outing. In the week since their trip to town, he had been quieter than usual, often disappearing to ride the property boundaries or work in the barn until late into the night. The revelation about Blackwood's son had changed something between them, created a deeper understanding, but also raised the stakes of their precarious situation. Blackwood's vendetta was personal, rooted in grief and blame. Such motivations were far more dangerous than mere financial interest. As they prepared breakfast together, moving around each other, with the easy familiarity of established routine, Abigail found herself studying Samuel's profile when he wasn't looking. The strong line of his jaw, the furrow between his brows that never quite disappeared, the careful precision of his hands, all spoke of a man whose life had taught him caution and self-containment. Yet, there were moments when that careful control slipped, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the gentleness with which he handled Nathan, the patience he showed teaching Matthew about ranch work, the rare half-smile that sometimes appeared when Grace or Hannah said something particularly innocent or amusing. The children emerged one by one from their sleeping areas, Matthew first already dressed in his best shirt, with his hair slicked down with water. Then the girls in their freshly pressed dresses, and finally Nathan clutching his ever-present drawing pad. The little boy had barely let the new colored pencils and pad out of his sight since Samuel had given them to him in town, creating increasingly detailed and colorful drawings that showed a world expanding beyond the dark mind tunnels that had dominated his art for so long. "You all look very fine," Abigail said, smiling at her children's attempts to appear grown-up and proper. "Remember your manners today. There will be other children at the social, and I expect you to behave as well as you would at home." "Yes, Mama," they chorused, even Matthew managing to suppress his usual adolescent eye roll at such instructions. Breakfast was a lively affair with the children too excited to maintain their usual morning quietude. Only Samuel remained reserved, though he answered questions when directly addressed and didn't discourage the children's enthusiasm. After the meal, as Abigail helped Hannah with the final touches to her hair ribbon, Samuel disappeared briefly to his room, emerging in what was clearly his Sunday best: a clean, dark shirt, well-worn but polished boots, and a coat that had seen better days, but had been brushed until the fabric shone. He had even trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, transforming himself from rugged rancher to something approaching a gentleman. The change wasn't lost on the children. Grace giggled behind her hand, while Matthew stared openly. "You look different, Mr. Hayes," Hannah declared with characteristic directness. Samuel adjusted his collar, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Church social's a proper occasion," he said by way of explanation. Abigail intervened to spare him further scrutiny. "Children, gather your things. It's time to go if we want to arrive before the service starts." The ride to town was pleasant, despite the morning chill, the wagon rolling smoothly along the now familiar trail. Nathan sat beside Abigail on the bench seat, while Samuel drove, and the other children rode in the back, wrapped in blankets against the cold. The little boy seemed more alert than usual, his eyes tracking the landscape with apparent interest, rather than the vacant stare that had been his norm for so long. As they approached Miller's Creek, Abigail felt Samuel tense beside her. The town appeared busier than on their previous visit, with horses and wagons hitched outside the small white church at the end of the main street. People in their Sunday best were gathering on the steps, greeting each other with the easy familiarity of a close-knit community. "Still time to turn back," Samuel muttered, only half-joking. Abigail smiled, understanding his discomfort. "It will be good for the children," she reminded him gently. "And for you, perhaps. How long has it been since you attended a service?" Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. "Not since before the war," he admitted. "Never seemed much point afterward." The quiet admission held volumes of unspoken pain. Abigail had encountered similar sentiments among the miners in Pennsylvania, men who had seen too much suffering to maintain faith in a benevolent God, or who felt themselves beyond redemption for actions taken in desperate circumstances. "We don't have to stay long," she offered, sensing his growing reluctance. "Just the service, and perhaps a brief appearance at the social afterward. Samuel nodded, steering the wagon toward the church. "Appreciate that." Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Conversations paused as heads turned in their direction, curious eyes taking in the unusual sight of the solitary rancher, accompanied by a woman and 4 children, all dressed in their Sunday best. Whispers followed them as Samuel helped Abigail and the children down from the wagon. Margaret Thompson broke away from a group of women to greet them. Her warm smile, a welcome contrast to the speculative stares of others. "Mrs. Harper, Samuel, I'm so pleased you decided to come." She bent slightly to address the children. "And these must be the young Harpers. My, what handsome children you have, Mrs. Harper." Grace and Hannah preened under the praise, while Matthew maintained a dignified silence, standing slightly in front of his younger siblings, as though prepared to shield them from unwelcome attention. Nathan pressed against Abigail's skirts, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar faces and voices. "Thank you for the invitation, Mrs. Thompson." Abigail replied, grateful for the friendly welcome. "We thought it would be good for the children to meet others their age." "Indeed it would," Margaret agreed. She lowered her voice slightly. "I should warn you, there's been quite a bit of talk since your last visit to town. Nothing malicious, mind you, just curiosity about your arrangement with Samuel here." Samuel shifted uncomfortably, but Abigail met Margaret's gaze steadily. "Mr. Hayes has been kind enough to offer us shelter while we establish ourselves in the territory. We're grateful for his hospitality." The simple explanation seemed to satisfy Margaret, who nodded approvingly. "Well said. Now let me introduce you to Reverend Collins before the service begins." The introductions passed in a blur of names and faces: the Reverend and his wife, the schoolteacher, Miss Winters, the blacksmith and his family, various ranchers and townspeople whose names Abigail immediately forgot in the rush of new information. Samuel remained at her side throughout a silent presence whose occasional nods were accepted as adequate greeting by those who knew him. The service itself was simple but heartfelt, led by Reverend Collins, a middle-aged man with a booming voice and genuine warmth. The small church was crowded with latecomers standing along the walls. Samuel, Abigail, and the children were ushered to a pew near the middle, where they attracted continued glances throughout the sermon. Nathan sat between Abigail and Samuel, his small body rigid with tension. When the congregation stood to sing, he remained seated, his eyes fixed on the colored glass window above the altar, where sunlight streamed through in patterns of blue and gold. Samuel didn't pressure him to stand or participate, merely placed a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder when the movement of the congregation seemed to overwhelm him. The gesture did not go unnoticed by Abigail, nor by several of the nearby churchgoers, whose whispers grew more speculative. She caught fragments, "taking on another man's children," and "awful quick after arriving," and once more ominously, "Blackwood won't stand for it." Samuel appeared oblivious to the gossip, or perhaps simply accustomed to being its subject. His attention remained on the service, though Abigail noticed his gaze regularly scanning the church, settling briefly on each entrance and window, as though assessing potential threats, a habit she guessed born of wartime vigilance that had never fully left him. After the service concluded, the congregation moved to the church hall for the social, a modest affair with tables of food prepared by the town's women, coffee and lemonade, and space cleared for children to play under supervision. Grace and Hannah were quickly absorbed into a group of girls their age, their initial shyness overcome by the universal appeal of dolls and ribbons. Matthew lingered near Samuel, reluctant to join the boys playing a noisy game in the corner. "Go on," Samuel encouraged him quietly. "Might do you good to spend time with lads your own age." Matthew hesitated, glancing at Abigail for confirmation. When she nodded, he squared his shoulders and approached the group accepted after a moment's assessment by the other boys. His obvious pride in being included brought a smile to Abigail's face. Nathan, however, refused to leave her side, clinging to her skirts with unusual insistence. The noise and unfamiliar surroundings clearly distressed him, his eyes darting nervously from face to face. "Perhaps some fresh air would help," Abigail suggested, noticing how the little boy flinched at each burst of laughter or raised voice. "Nathan and I might step outside for a few minutes." Samuel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll keep watch on the others." Abigail led Nathan to a small garden behind the church, where wooden benches offered a quiet retreat from the social's bustle. The little boy's shoulders relaxed as soon as they left the crowded hall, his grip on her hand loosening slightly. They sat together on a bench, the autumn sun warm on their faces despite the crisp air. Nathan reached for his drawing pad, which he had insisted on bringing, despite Abigail's suggestion that it might be better left at home for such an occasion. Now she was glad he had it, watching as he began to sketch the church steeple visible above the garden wall, his small face intent on capturing its details. "I thought I might find you here," came a voice that sent a chill through Abigail despite the sunshine. She looked up to see Victor Blackwood standing at the garden entrance, impeccably dressed in a suit that would not have looked out of place in Philadelphia or New York. His smile was polite, even charming, but his eyes remained cold as he approached their bench. "Mr. Blackwood," Abigail acknowledged instinctively, drawing Nathan closer to her side. "I didn't realize you attended Reverend Collins's services." "Oh, I'm a pillar of the community, Mrs. Harper," Blackwood replied, his tone faintly mocking. "Bank, church, town council, I believe, in supporting local institutions." He gestured to the bench. "May I join you?" It wasn't really a question, as he was already seating himself before Abigail could respond. Nathan pressed harder against her side, his drawing forgotten, as he regarded the banker with wary eyes. "Your children seem to be settling in well," Blackwood observed, nodding toward the church hall, where Grace's laughter could be heard even through the closed doors. "Miller's Creek is a fine place to raise a family. Growing fast, too, with the railroad coming through." "So I've heard," Abigail replied neutrally, sensing the conversation was leading somewhere she might not wish to follow. Blackwood turned slightly to face her more directly, his manner shifting to one of apparent concern. "Mrs. Harper, I hope you'll forgive my directness, but I feel obligated to speak with you, one parent to another." He lowered his voice, though there was no one nearby to overhear. "I'm concerned about your current living arrangements." Abigail stiffened. "My arrangements are my own concern, Mr. Blackwood." "Under normal circumstances, I would agree," he continued smoothly. "But these are hardly normal circumstances, are they? A widow with 4 young children, living unchaperoned with a bachelor, and not just any bachelor, but Hayes." He shook his head, feigning regret. "People talk, Mrs. Harper. Reputations are easily damaged in a small town like this." "Mr. Hayes has been nothing but respectful and kind," Abigail stated firmly. "He offered shelter when we had nowhere else to go." Of course," Blackwood agreed too readily. "Hayes has always had a soft spot for strays, but kindness doesn't put food on the table or provide security for the future, does it?" He leaned closer, dropping all pretense of casual conversation. "You should know that Hayes will lose that ranch within the week. The loan is coming due, and he doesn't have the funds to cover it. What will happen to you and your children then?" The direct confirmation of what Samuel had already told her did not surprise Abigail, but Blackwood's next words did. "I could help you, Mrs. Harper. A woman of your quality deserves better than living hand-to-mouth on a failing ranch with a man haunted by the war. I have a large home in town servants' connections, Your children could attend proper schools back east. I've been lonely since my wife passed, and a companion would be welcome." The offer was presented as generosity, but Abigail recognized the calculation behind it, the same calculation she had seen in the eyes of her brother-in-law and other men after Joseph's death. The assumption that a widow with children would accept any port in a storm, any protection, regardless of the personal cost. "That's very considerate of you, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, carefully aware of Nathan's presence and the need to remain civil. "But I'm not looking for a new arrangement at present." Blackwood's smile tightened. "Consider it carefully, Mrs. Harper. Hayes can't provide for your children. I can." His gaze shifted to Nathan, who was watching him with solemn, wary eyes. "The boy still doesn't speak, I notice. A proper doctor might help with that. I know several fine physicians in Denver who specialize in such cases." The mention of Nathan's condition as a bargaining chip made anger flare in Abigail's chest, but she controlled it, aware that antagonizing Blackwood would only make their situation more precarious. "Thank you for your concern," she said, rising from the bench and drawing Nathan up with her. "If you'll excuse us, I should check on my other children." Blackwood remained seated, his expression calculating. "1 week, Mrs. Harper. When Hayes loses the ranch, my offer remains open. For the children's sake, I hope you'll reconsider." Abigail didn't dignify this with a response, merely inclined her head slightly before leading Nathan back toward the church hall. Her heart was pounding, a mixture of anger and anxiety, making her steps quicker than usual. The little boy trotted beside her, clutching his drawing pad with white-knuckled fingers. Inside the hall, she quickly located Samuel, who was engaged in conversation with the blacksmith, or rather listening with occasional nods, as the other man talked animatedly. He looked up as she approached, something in her expression, causing him to excuse himself immediately. "What happened?" he asked quietly, drawing her slightly away from the crowd. "Blackwood," Abigail replied, keeping her voice low. "In the garden. He made an offer of protection, for me and the children, when you lose the ranch." Samuel's expression hardened, his eyes flicking toward the garden entrance. "Did he threaten you?" "Not directly, but he made it clear he expects you to default on the loan within the week." Abigail hesitated, then added, "He mentioned doctors in Denver who might help Nathan, as an inducement." A muscle worked in Samuel's jaw, and for a moment Abigail glimpsed the soldier beneath the quiet rancher's exterior, a man capable of controlled violence when necessary. Then he exhaled slowly, visibly reining in his anger. "Time to go," he said. "Gather the children." They collected Matthew, Grace, and Hannah with minimal protest, the children sensing the sudden tension in their mother and Samuel. As they made their way toward the church entrance, Reverend Collins intercepted them. "Leaving so soon, Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Harper?" The minister inquired, genuine disappointment in his tone. The children seemed to be enjoying themselves. "Another time, perhaps," Samuel replied, his manner polite but distant. "Ranch work doesn't stop for Sunday." The minister nodded, though his gaze lingered on Abigail with obvious concern. Of course. But please know you're always welcome here. All of you." He lowered his voice slightly. "And if there's anything you need, anything at all, my door is always open." Abigail thanked him, sincerely touched by the offer and the kindness behind it. As they stepped outside, she noticed Blackwood had rejoined the social, now deep in conversation, with several well-dressed townsmen near the refreshment table. He glanced up as they passed, raising his coffee cup, in a mock salute that only Samuel seemed to notice. The ride back to the ranch was subdued, the children's initial excitement about their new acquaintances gradually fading into thoughtful silence as they sensed the adults' preoccupation. Even Hannah, usually full of chatter, merely leaned against Grace in the wagon bed, her small face pensive. It wasn't until they were halfway home that Matthew broke the silence. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his young voice serious beyond his years, "are we going to lose the ranch?" Samuel's hands tightened on the reins, but he didn't immediately answer. Abigail held her breath, uncertain how he would respond to such a direct question. "Not without a fight," Samuel said finally, his tone measured. "But it's a possibility you should be prepared for." Matthew nodded, absorbing this with the gravity of a child who had already faced significant loss. "If it happens," he continued after a moment, "where will we go?" The question hung in the air, laden with implications. Samuel glanced at Abigail, silently deferring to her as the children's mother. But before she could formulate a response, Grace spoke up from the wagon bed. "We'll stay together, won't we?" she asked, her voice small but determined. "All of us." The innocent question struck Abigail with unexpected force. In her mind, she had still been thinking of Samuel as separate from them, a kind benefactor, perhaps even a friend, but not truly part of their family unit. Yet, in Grace's understanding, shaped by these weeks of living together, he had already been incorporated into their we. Samuel cleared his throat, clearly caught off guard by the directness of the question. "That would be up to your mother," he said carefully. "But whatever happens, I'll make sure you all have somewhere safe to go." The conversation lapsed into silence once more, but something had shifted. A question had been asked that could not be unasked, an assumption voiced that could not be unvoiced. For the remainder of the journey, Abigail found herself stealing glances at Samuel's profile, wondering if he had noticed the significance of Grace's "all of us" and what it might mean for their future. The ranch came into view as they crested the final rise, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. The sight of it, the cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, the barn and corrals, the rolling pasture beyond, brought a pang to Abigail's heart. In just a few short weeks, this place had begun to feel like home in a way no place had since Joseph's death. The thought of losing it, of uprooting her children yet again, was almost unbearable. But more unsettling was the realization that her distress stemmed not just from the prospect of losing the ranch itself, but from the thought of losing Samuel, his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness with the children, his growing place in their lives. When had that happened? When had this taciturn, wounded man become someone whose absence would leave a void? As Samuel helped her down from the wagon, his hand strong and steady around her waist, their eyes met briefly. Something passed between them, a recognition perhaps of the crossroads they had reached. Then the moment was broken, as the children scrambled down, eager to change out of their Sunday clothes and return to their normal activities. "I need to check the north pasture fence," Samuel said, his tone deliberately casual. "Thought I saw a weak section yesterday. Won't be long." Abigail nodded, understanding his need for solitude after the social's demands and Blackwood's provocations. "We'll have supper ready when you return." He acknowledged this with a slight nod, then strode toward the barn, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Watching him go, Abigail felt a certainty settle in her heart. Whatever came, whatever decision Blackwood forced upon them, she would not accept his offer. Some prices were too high, some sacrifices too great, even for the security he promised. Inside the cabin, as she helped the children change and began preparations for the evening meal, Abigail found herself taking stock of their situation with clearer eyes than before. Samuel had a week, perhaps less, before Blackwood called in the loan. Their options were limited, but not non-existent. If Samuel could gather enough funds to make a partial payment, perhaps Blackwood could be persuaded to extend the terms. Or they might all relocate to another territory, pooling their resources to start fresh elsewhere. The thought of leaving Wyoming brought unexpected reluctance. This wild, beautiful land had begun to work its way into her heart, just as its quiet, steadfast inhabitant had. As she peeled potatoes at the kitchen table, lost in thought, Nathan appeared at her side. The little boy tugged at her sleeve, then held out his drawing pad when she turned to him. Curious Abigail set aside her work to examine the page. Nathan had drawn the church from that morning, its white steeple precise against a blue sky. But it was the foreground that caught her breath, 6 figures standing together before the building holding hands in a chain. A family. Their family as seen through her youngest child's eyes. "Oh, Nathan," she whispered, gathering him close, "is this how you see us?" The little boy nodded against her shoulder, his small body warm and trusting in her embrace. For the first time since Joseph's death, Abigail allowed herself to imagine a future that contained more than mere survival, a future with happiness, with belonging, perhaps even with love. The sound of hoofbeats approaching at speed shattered the moment. Nathan tensed in her arms, his head lifting at the unfamiliar rhythm, too fast for Samuel's usual measured pace, too heavy for a single rider. Matthew was at the window in an instant, his young face alert with the wariness of a child who had learned that unexpected visitors often meant trouble. "Riders coming," he reported. "3 of them. One looks like that banker from town." Alarm coursed through Abigail. "Grace, take Hannah and Nathan to the back room," she instructed, keeping her voice calm despite her racing heart. "Stay there until I call you." Grace didn't question the order, immediately gathering her younger siblings and ushering them toward the sleeping area. Matthew remained at the window, his expression resolute. "I'm staying with you, Mama," he declared, brooking no argument. Abigail didn't have time to insist otherwise as the riders drew up in the yard, their horses blowing hard from the pace they'd been pushed to maintain. Through the window she recognized Blackwood astride his sleek bay, accompanied by 2 rough-looking men she didn't know, not Jenkins and his cronies from town, but strangers with the hard eyes and ready stance of hired guns. "Where's Samuel?" she asked Matthew urgently. "Still checking the north pasture," her son replied, his young voice tight with tension. "He won't have heard them coming." Abigail's mind raced. Whatever Blackwood wanted arriving with armed men at sunset couldn't bode well. She needed to buy time until Samuel returned. "Stay inside," she told Matthew firmly. "If anything happens, take your siblings and run for the creek bed. You can follow it all the way to the Thompson place." Before Matthew could protest, she stepped outside, closing the cabin door behind her. Standing on the porch, she faced the 3 riders with as much composure as she could muster, though her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Mr. Blackwood," she greeted him, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is an unexpected visit." Blackwood dismounted with fluid grace, handing his reins to one of his companions. "Mrs. Harper," he replied, his manner cordial despite the circumstances. "I apologize for the intrusion, but business couldn't wait until morning." He glanced around the yard. "Is Hayes about?" "Mr. Hayes is checking the property," Abigail answered, deliberately vague. "I expect him back shortly." "How convenient," Blackwood observed with a thin smile. "Perhaps we might wait inside. The evening grows chill." Abigail stood her ground, blocking the cabin door. "I prefer not to disturb the children. They're settling down for the night." The lie came easily, protective instinct overriding her usual honesty. "What business brings you here at this hour, Mr. Blackwood?" The banker's smile faded, his pretense of civility giving way to a harder expression. "The matter of Hayes's loan. I've decided to call it due immediately rather than waiting for the end of the week, given certain information that's come to my attention." "What information would that be?" Abigail asked, playing for time, her eyes scanning the darkening landscape for any sign of Samuel's return. That Hayes intends to sell off his remaining cattle and flee the territory, Blackwood replied smoothly. Taking you and your children with him, I understand. A man in my position can't allow such deliberate evasion of financial obligations. The accusation was absurd. Samuel had mentioned no such plan, and his character, as she had come to know it, would never permit such dishonorable action. But Blackwood's tone made it clear that truth was irrelevant to his purpose. That's ridiculous, Abigail stated flatly. Mr. Hayes has every intention of meeting his obligations. He's an honorable man. Blackwood laughed, the sound sharp in the gathering dusk. Honorable Hayes, the man who let my son die on a battlefield while he saved others who fled east after the war rather than face me. His voice had risen, composure cracking, to reveal the rage beneath. He's a coward who hides behind a woman's skirts, now it seems. You're wrong about him, Abigail said quietly, her resolve strengthening despite the growing danger. Your son's death was a tragedy, but it wasn't Samuel's fault. He was one medic among hundreds of wounded soldiers. He made a choice, Blackwood hissed, stepping closer to the porch. Every medic makes choices who to save, who to leave. He chose to let Miles die. The raw grief in his voice momentarily disarmed Abigail. Whatever else Blackwood might be, his pain as a father was genuine, festering for over a decade without healing or closure. I lost my husband in a mine collapse, she said softly. I know what it is to search for someone to blame, to need a reason for senseless loss. But vengeance won't bring your son back, Mr. Blackwood. It won't ease your pain. For a moment, something flickered in Blackwood's eyes, recognition perhaps, or a hint of the man he might have been before grief hardened him. Then it was gone, replaced by cold determination. Step aside, Mrs. Harper, he ordered. My men will search the property for Hayes, and I'll take what's owed me in cattle, if not in cash. You have no right, Abigail began, but fell silent as one of Blackwood's men drew a revolver from his holster. Ma'am, the hired gun drawled, best not interfere with bank business. Mr. Blackwood here has legal papers. He patted his coat pocket, all nice and proper-like. The cabin door opened behind her, and Matthew stepped out, his young face pale but resolute. Leave my mother alone, he demanded, his voice cracking slightly but his stance firm. Matthew, go back inside. Abigail urged, fear for her son overwhelming all other concerns. Blackwood's attention shifted to the boy, his expression calculating. Brave lad, he commented. Reminds me of my Miles at that age, full of vinegar and short on sense. He nodded to his men. Search the outbuildings, find Hayes, and round up the best of the cattle. We'll drive them to town tonight. As the hired guns moved to obey, a single shot cracked across the yard. One of the men's hats flew from his head, and he dropped to a crouch, cursing. That's far enough, came Samuel's voice from the darkness beyond the barn. He emerged slowly, rifle raised and ready, his face set in grim lines. Next one won't miss Jensen. The hired gun named Jensen froze clearly, recognizing the voice and the threat it carried. His companion reached for his weapon, but stopped at a sharp gesture from Blackwood. Hayes, the banker called, seeming unsurprised by the dramatic entrance. Just the man I've been waiting for. We have business to conclude. Samuel continued his approach rifle, unwavering. Get off my land, Blackwood. Take your dogs with you. Your land? Blackwood laughed. Not anymore. The loan is due Hayes. Every cent right now, or I take possession as per our agreement. He withdrew a folded document from his coat. all legal and binding. Sheriff Waters signed as witness just this afternoon." Samuel reached the edge of the yard, positioning himself between the intruders and the porch where Abigail and Matthew stood. "Loan's not due till the end of the week," he stated flatly. "You're jumping the gun as usual." "The terms of the loan allow for immediate collection upon evidence of intent to default," Blackwood countered smoothly. "And I have sworn statements from reliable witnesses that you plan to sell your herd and flee the territory." He smiled thinly. "So unless you have $250 in cash at hand, this ranch and everything on it now belongs to the First Bank of Miller's Creek, meaning me." The amount struck Abigail like a physical blow. $250 was a fortune, more than a year's wages for a miner back in Pennsylvania, far more than anything Samuel could hope to gather on such short notice. But Samuel's expression didn't change. "And if I had it?" he asked, his tone conversational despite the rifle in his hands. "The full amount right now. What then?" Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. "Then the loan would be satisfied, of course. But we both know you don't have it, Hayes. You've been scraping by for years." "Assumptions are dangerous things," Samuel commented mildly. He shifted his rifle to one hand, reaching slowly into his coat with the other. What he withdrew made Blackwood's eyes widen, a thick envelope, its edges worn as though long carried. $250, Samuel stated, holding it up. "Exactly what's owed, not a penny more or less." "Care to count it?" Shock registered briefly on Blackwood's face before he mastered it. "Where did you get that kind of money, Hayes? No one extends credit to you but me." "Saved it," Samuel replied simply. "A little at a time over years, for emergencies." His eyes met Blackwood's squarely, like vermin infestations. The insult landed as intended. Blackwood's face flushed with anger, but he controlled it, extending his hand for the envelope. "Very well. If the money's legitimate, the debt is cleared." Samuel made no move to hand over the envelope. "Not quite that simple," he said. "I want a signed receipt, witnessed by Mrs. Harper here, stating the loan is paid in full. And I want your word for whatever that's worth, that you'll leave my property and never return." Blackwood's jaw worked as he considered his options. His hired guns looked to him for direction, clearly uncomfortable with the standoff. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Jensen, bring my writing case from my saddlebag," he instructed. As the man moved to obey, Blackwood turned back to Samuel. "You've won this round, Hayes, but don't think it ends here. The railroad's coming through, and this land will be worth 10 times what it is now. I'll make you another offer you can't afford to refuse." "There won't be another loan," Samuel stated flatly. "And the railroad can find another route." Jensen returned with a small leather case which Blackwood opened to reveal paper, ink, and a pen. With quick, angry strokes, he wrote out a receipt, signed it with a flourish, and thrust it toward Abigail. "Witness this, Mrs. Harper," he said coldly. "Your protector has bought himself a temporary reprieve, nothing more." Abigail took the paper, scanning its contents carefully before adding her signature beside Blackwood's. Only then did Samuel hand over the envelope, which Blackwood opened immediately to count the contents. Satisfied, he tucked it into his coat pocket. "Our business is concluded," he announced, his tone frosty. "For now." He turned to go, then paused, looking back at Abigail. "My offer remains open, Mrs. Harper. When you tire of living hand-to-mouth with a man who keeps secrets, even from those closest to him, you know where to find me." Samuel's expression darkened at the implication, but he held his peace, as Blackwood and his men mounted their horses and rode away, dust swirling in their wake. Only when they had disappeared beyond the rise did he lower his rifle, tension visibly draining from his shoulders. "Are you all right?" he asked Abigail, his voice gentler than before. She nodded relief, making her slightly light-headed. Yes, but Samuel, that money, you said you'd been saving it for years. Was it meant for something else? A shadow crossed his face. Nothing important, he said, turning away to secure the rifle. Just a notion I had once. Doesn't matter now. Matthew, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, spoke up. You saved the ranch, Mr. Hayes, he said, admiration clear in his young voice. That was amazing. Samuel ruffled the boy's hair, a rare gesture of affection that made Matthew stand straighter. Ranch is worth saving, he replied simply. Now go check on your siblings. Your mother and I need to talk. As Matthew disappeared into the cabin, calling reassurances to Grace Hannah and Nathan Samuel, turned back to Abigail. In the fading light, his face seemed older, marked by the weight of decisions made and paths chosen. I need to tell you something, he said quietly. About that money. Where it really came from. Abigail's heart sank, a premonition of painful truth, making her brace herself. I'm listening. Samuel leaned against the porch railing, his gaze directed at the darkening horizon rather than at her. After the war, I couldn't go home right away. Couldn't speak, couldn't sleep without nightmares. Drifted for a while, working odd jobs, moving on when the memories got too close. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Ended up in Denver. Found work with a doctor there, not as a medic, just handling his horses, maintaining his equipment. Simple work that didn't require talking. He fell silent for a moment, and Abigail waited, sensing the importance of whatever would come next. Doctor had a daughter. Samuel continued finally, his voice lower than before. Sarah, kind woman, patient with a broken soldier who couldn't even say his own name most days. We married after a year, had a son 8 months later. Named him Daniel after my brother, who died at Gettysburg. The revelation stunned Abigail. Samuel had been married before, had fathered a child. Yet, he lived alone, spoke of them in the past tense. The implications made her heart ache with anticipation of the tragedy to come. What happened? She asked softly. Samuel's hands tightened on the porch railing. Fire, he said, the single word laden with unimaginable pain. I was away delivering medicines to outlying homesteads. Lamp exploded in the kitchen. Sarah and Daniel were trapped upstairs. His voice had flattened emotion pressed down beneath the weight of long practice. By the time I got back, there was nothing left, just ashes and 2 graves. Abigail closed her eyes briefly, grief for his loss washing through her. I'm so sorry, Samuel. He nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy, without looking at her. Sarah's father had set aside money for her, a dowry of sorts, though he called it an investment in our future. After they died, I couldn't touch it. Felt wrong somehow, but I couldn't leave it behind either, so I kept it all these years. He finally turned to face her, his eyes shadowed in the gathering darkness. That's what I used today. Sarah and Daniel's money. To save this place. The admission clearly cost him each word drawn from some deep reserve of pain he usually kept carefully contained. Abigail understood then what the money had represented to him, not just financial security, but a tangible connection to the family he had lost, perhaps the last thing he had of them. Do you think they would mind, she asked gently, if they knew what it was used for? Samuel considered this, his gaze turning inward. Sarah would have approved, he said finally. She believed in making a home, in helping others. Daniel. He faltered slightly. Daniel was only 2 when they died. Too young to have opinions on such things. Abigail moved closer, placing her hand lightly on his arm. Then you honored them both today, she said with quiet conviction, by using what they left to build something worthwhile, to protect a home and the people in it. Samuel looked down at her hand on his arm, then up to meet her eyes. The vulnerability she saw there made her breath catch a glimpse, behind the careful walls he maintained, into the depths of a heart that had known profound loss, yet remained capable of care, of connection. Blackwood will be back, he warned, his practical nature reasserting itself. Maybe not tomorrow or next week, but eventually. He doesn't let go of grudges. Then we'll face him together, Abigail replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. All of us. The simple declaration hung between them, fraught with implications neither was quite ready to voice. Samuel's expression shifted, hope warring with caution in his pale eyes. Before he could respond, the cabin door opened, spilling lamplight into the darkening yard. Nathan stood in the doorway, his small figure silhouetted against the warm glow from within. He held his drawing pad in one hand, a colored pencil in the other. "Nathan," Abigail called, concern threading her voice, "you should be inside with your sisters." The little boy didn't move, his solemn gaze fixed on Samuel. Then, with deliberate steps, he crossed the porch to stand before the rancher. He opened his drawing pad, turned to a fresh page, and held it up along with the blue pencil. Samuel crouched to the child's level, accepting both items with careful hands. "What's this, son?" he asked gently. Nathan pointed to the blank page, then to Samuel, then back to the page. His meaning was clear. Even without words, he wanted Samuel to draw something. A look of uncertainty crossed Samuel's face. "I'm not much of an artist," he admitted. "Not like you." Nathan's expression remained expectant, patient. After a moment's hesitation, Samuel sat on the porch step, balancing the pad on his knee. With slow, deliberate strokes, he began to draw, not with the skill of practice, but with the care of someone to whom the task mattered deeply. Abigail watched, her heart full, as this man who had lost so much bent his head over a child's drawing pad, creating something new at the request of a boy who could not speak. In that moment, with night falling softly around them, and the warmth of the cabin beckoning behind, she felt the last of her doubts dissolve. They were no longer temporary residents seeking shelter, no longer beneficiaries of charity. They were becoming something else entirely, something unexpected and precious. A family pieced together from broken parts, stronger, for having been reforged in the crucible of shared adversity. As if sensing her thoughts, Samuel looked up, his eyes meeting hers over Nathan's head. The connection between them was almost tangible, a bridge built of understanding, respect, and something deeper that neither was quite ready to name. "Let's go inside," she suggested softly. "It's getting cold, and Grace has supper waiting." Samuel nodded, rising to his feet, but keeping hold of Nathan's hand. Together, the three of them crossed the porch and entered the warm light of the cabin, closing the door against the gathering night and whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. For now, they were home. For now, they were safe. And for now, that was enough.